right, so each of the plagues, as we have laid them out, have identifiable characteristics. There's an instruction given to Moses and or Aaron. There's then a demonstration, a compliance with those instructions, and then there is a reaction, which 90% of the time is exactly the same. Pharaoh hardened his heart, and he would not let Israel go. That pattern repeats itself throughout all of the 10 plagues. In this case, we've just read the instruction. Go out. I want you to go to Pharaoh, because I have a message for him. But notice the significance of it. This time, he says that I can show these signs of mine before him, before Pharaoh, before his servants, that you, Moses, and those after you may tell in the hearing of your sons the mighty things that I have done in Egypt, that you may know that I am the Lord. Now that's an impressive thing for God to say, because at this point in time, what he's about to accomplish has less to do with what Pharaoh will conclude, but what is able to be accomplished through the carrying on of that message for future generations. It is a message to all believers. In this, there's a rhetorical question. Verse 3, Moses and Aaron before Pharaoh, they say, how long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? I say rhetorical because we're not really given an answer, but it also seems that it's self-evident that he is going to continue to do that. Verse 4 says, if you refuse to let the people go, tomorrow, God says, I will bring locusts over the land. They will cover the face of the earth. You want to be able to see the earth. And everything that was left from the hail, you remember the hail destroyed crops in the field, it destroyed livestock. Here we're told that everything that was left would be consumed, every tree even, would be consumed by these locusts who would fill the houses. At the end of verse 6, there's kind of this very excited turn of events. We read there that Moses turned and went out from Pharaoh. You know, you didn't just turn your back on the king of Egypt and walk out. You're learning something about Moses standing before Pharaoh. Verse 7, there's a deliberation that takes place. We know there's a deliberation because there's a conversation where Pharaoh's servants, probably his court officials, his advisors, his cabinet, however we want to look at that. How long shall this man be a snare to us? Now notice their focus is completely wrong. They think their big problem right now is Moses. Their concentration's on Moses. It isn't Moses, it's the God that Moses is serving. They haven't made that connection. But they counsel Pharaoh, let the men go, that they can serve the Lord their God. His own counselors are saying, we've had it. Do you not know, Pharaoh, that Egypt is destroyed? Very likely he didn't. How many kings, how many princes, how many presidents are out and about in the daily affairs of the people that they rule? He had been touched, make no mistake about it. We can't read this without seeing that, but yeah, his knowledge was a little less than perfect. So Moses and Aaron are brought in again to Pharaoh, and he says to them in verse 8, you go serve the Lord, but may I ask you, who's going? The response by Moses, beginning in verse 9, is basically everybody. All of us. Our young, our old, all of our flocks, we're going. Implying the obvious, we're leaving. We're packing up and going. Verse 10 is one of those challenging verses in your Bible that's kind of tricky for people who translate. The New King James reads this way. Pharaoh said to them, The Lord had better be with you when I let you and your little ones go. Beware, for evil is ahead of you. Not so, verse 11. That's clumsy. It's clumsy in English. Here's something to consider that might help us. It's obviously sarcastic, but one scholar interpreted it this way. True, God will be with you when I decide to let you go. But you're obviously up to no good. So no. That probably is the spirit of what he's saying. In other words, it will be a blessing to you whenever I let you go serve your God. But obviously because you're planning to pack up everybody, all of your goods, all of your animals, all of your people, and you're wanting to go out into the wilderness and leave Egypt, you obviously have something not good up your sleeve. You're probably going to go out there and join an army and you're going to invade us. So, no. We won't be having that. Well, there's probably more to this. He says, go, you who are men. Take your men, you serve the Lord. And they're driven out of Pharaoh's presence. I mean, contrast that. Earlier, Moses walked around and he walked out. Now Pharaoh, enraged, throws them out. Well, that's different. That's much different. We could ask, is it because he turned his back on him earlier? I don't know. They send him out. So God instructs Moses, take your rod, stretch it out. We read in verse 13 that there was an east wind all the day and all the night. Now, what that probably leads us to conclude is that the locusts didn't come all at once. It was probably a gradual approach. Perhaps you could hear them. Perhaps you could see them. You've been around these critters. You know they make a lot of noise. They destroy everything in their path. And it's very likely that as this wind was carrying them toward Egypt, that the sound began to come and all through the night. Well, they're horrible. We're told it's very severe. So severe, everything that God had predicted comes to be. Verse 16, Pharaoh calls for Moses and Aaron in haste. Now remember, he just kicked them out. And now, after some period of the locusts doing what locusts do, he in haste calls for them and basically commands them, you come back in. You come back in, and he says this, what I would submit to you is a very disingenuous statement. I've sinned against the Lord your God and against you. Please forgive my sin only this once, and entreat, beg, pray for me. Pray the Lord your God that he will take away from me this death. And we have to dig what's dying. All of Egypt. Their entire economy is now gone. They have nothing with which to trade. They have nothing with which to feed their people. It is very likely when he says, save me from this death, he's not worried about people dying, but the nation dying, and that happening under his watch. Everything is destroyed. Well, they go out at that response. They do pray, and then the locusts leave. We're told there's not one that remains. The reaction? But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart by giving him the opportunity. He did not let the children go. What do you learn from the plague of locusts? God's sovereignty. The beginning of this chapter, those first two verses that we read, he said, Pharaoh, I have raised you up. Well, he didn't say that, but he applied it. In chapter 9, he did say it. I have raised you up in order that I can, at this time, show to my people exactly what I can do. I have raised you up. I have selected you as the ruler. I've selected this as the time. I am showing all of my mighty works, and I'm doing that so that I can, for hundreds, thousands of generations later, convince people that I am the sovereign God. Well, that's a lot to learn from a locust. But I think it's a lesson we can learn. Plague number 8 is the locusts. Pardon me? Absolutely so. Absolutely so. And the benefit, right? We're studying it tonight because of God's sovereignty and the way that He has demonstrated it. Right. Right. Hail would have done all kinds of damage. All of their places. Good point. Locusts, of all things. Now, again, we can't bear it out in full detail, but each of these plagues is targeted toward at least one of the pagan gods of the Egyptians. So all of those ideas are very wonderfully put. The plague of locusts. Plague number 9 is different. We haven't only destroyed property and some people. Now it's full-blown terror. Full-blown terror. Look with me at verses number, 20. Well, the plague of darkness, verse 21. The Lord said to Moses, now you notice there's no preliminary go talk to Pharaoh here. This is apparently quite opposite to the locusts. This is sudden. This is instantaneous. Stretch out your hand toward heaven, that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt. Darkness which may even be felt. All right, what comes to your mind when you hear that phrase? Darkness that may be felt. Okay. An immobilizing darkness. Very good. What else? Huh? Very good. Right. Both of you said exactly the same thing. Fear. Okay. What else? Okay. Something that was perhaps physical. Something that you could feel. You remember when the eclipse went by last summer, right? There's something that changes in the air, even in normal cycles. However, something that can be felt. Now, a lot of people argue, and it's probably closer. In reality, everything we've just said, I believe, is on some level true. Some people believe that the more accurate rendering would be a darkness that causes one to have to feel around, to grope around. In other words, it's so severe. It's like that darkness. I don't know if you've ever been in the deepest or a deep part of a coal mine, or if you've been in the deep part of a cave. When you get down in those, go to Mammoth Cave sometime, and they take you down there, and everybody turns off the light. What do you see? Do you like it? No. If you were to turn around and try to get out of there, will your eyes ever adapt so that you can see well in that environment? No, you can't. So you have to literally feel your way around, right? Now, I believe there was something physical involved here too. It's just my opinion. But I believe the effect is the same. Scared to death, unable to move. Why is it that in the modern penal systems you're no longer able to put people in solitary confinement and restrict them from light? Because it's torture. It changes the mind, the intellect, the psyche. This is torturous by our standards. This is a horrific kind of environment. It's horrible. Moses did so. This thick darkness descends for 3 days, so that the text says they did not see one another, no matter where they were. You can't see the person in the room. Your house isn't that dark. There's no place naturally in the world that's so dark that you can't see the person next to you. At least not for long. It says also that they did not rise from their place for those 3 days. Paralyzed. Yes, Randy. Why wouldn't they have had fire on the outside? Yeah, it's an intriguing question. Okay, perhaps the answer is best thought of this way. Most of the little oil lamps that they had where they would have flame would have a very small reservoir of oil. And without a lot of preparation beforehand, you're not going to have enough in your house to supply that for a lengthy period of time. Perhaps that's why it went for 3 days. So long that the most prepared people in the ordinary sense, in the ordinary part of Egypt, they probably wouldn't have enough oil on hand to provide any amount of light. Not to mention, if there's something more physical here than just a darkness, it might have suppressed it a little bit too. Yeah. True. Right. 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 It's a peculiar kind of darkness. Randy, that's my best shot at why they couldn't use a flame. Because they probably just didn't have enough fuel without going out to get more, which they couldn't do. So I think in time, their ordinary, everybody in this culture went to bed at dark. And that's just how it worked. You had very little around. And they probably just ran out. But that's conjecture on my part. It's a good question, though. Yeah. Yeah, very good. God's using the darkness to show them how blind they are, we might say figuratively. But now look at the next verse, or the end of verse 23. But all the children of Israel had light in their dwellings. Again, conjecture on my part. I believe this is natural light. I believe this is just business as usual. I believe there's a clear distinction between the natural phenomenon of light and darkness taking place on one side of Egypt and the other. Now, some people believe, those who are more naturally inclined, that there was some kind of advance warning given. I see nothing in the text to indicate that allowed the Israelites to have enough fuel on hand. Well, I think that's ridiculous. But that's just my opinion. But don't miss the terror. Don't miss the terror. Pharaoh called for Moses, seemingly at the end of the 3 days, and said, "Go serve the Lord, only let your flocks and your herds be kept back. Even your little ones can go with you." What is the unwritten implication of what he just said? Pardon me? Well, make a stop, yes, that's very true. But how about the people who would be permitted to leave? You guys go. That's right. So you leave your stuff of value behind. All right, so if they leave all of their flocks behind, one of two things is going to happen. They're either going to belong to somebody else when they get back, or they're going to die. It implies not all of you are going to go. You're going to have to leave enough people back here to take care of those flocks, to feed them, to take care of them, to make sure nothing happens to them. You're going to have to leave enough that you have a compelling reason to come back. We've pointed this out before. Say what we want about Pharaoh. He was smart. He's a wily kind of character. Okay, he knows that if they leave their flocks behind, they're going to have to leave some people behind too. Well, Moses in verse 25 says, well, you must give us sacrifices, those animals that we will consume in our relationship with our God, and our offerings, the ones that we will offer as a gift to Him. Those involve animal sacrifices, Pharaoh. We may sacrifice to the Lord our God, and you have to let us take them. He goes on to say, we're going out there to serve the Lord, and to this point in time, we don't even know how many of those animals we're going to need, or which ones we're going to need. God hasn't told us yet. We won't know till we arrive there. But the Lord, here's our reaction again in verse 27, hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let them go. Familiar. And Pharaoh said to him, get away from me. Now, how much effect did a command like that have in the realm of the palace here? A lot. That's right. No options. Get away from me. Go away. Leave. All right? Take heed to yourself. So he gives that charge, and now he goes into a tantrum. See to it that you do not see my face anymore. Go away and never come back. Now the irony is, he's been calling for Moses as much as Moses has been calling on him. Go away, never come back. And now he makes a threat. For in the day you see my face again, the next time, you will surely die. Don't come knocking again. So Moses said in verse 29, one of the most remarkable verses to me in this whole saga. You've spoken well. I'll never see you face to face again. That's interesting. Because more or less, Pharaoh throws this tantrum and throws him out. And Moses walks up to him and gives him a high five and says, you're exactly right. You're right on it, Pharaoh. I'm not going to see you anymore because I'm getting ready to leave. All right, that is magnificent. For him to say, you've said this right. We're not going to do this again. What do you learn from the plague of darkness? I submit to you, it's the majesty of God. Moses said in verse 25, we must sacrifice to the Lord our God. He deserves our praise. He deserves our worship. Exactly how He prescribes, exactly when He prescribes. He is worthy of that, and we will render it, Pharaoh, whether you let us or not. He's a God of majesty. Very true. Very true. Yeah. This negotiation, if we want to call it that goes back and forth between the two, it is interesting. I mean, And you do. You see Moses progressively increase in confidence, brazenness. He becomes more bold. But a minute ago we entertained this notion. He's also growing in estimation of those around Pharaoh. Okay? Whose families are not. Now you tell me, what's the last plague? The death of the firstborn. The death of the firstborn. And in truth, it does exactly the same thing. It goes through an instruction period where God is speaking to Moses. There's a demonstration where exactly what God says will take place. And there is a reaction. But this time the reaction is different. What's the reaction this time? Pharaoh called for Moses, chapter 12, verse 31, and Aaron by night, and said, "Rise, get out from among my people, both you and the children of Israel, and go serve the Lord as you have said." He says, "Leave." Now, how's that for a quick summary? Before we do anything, let's see what we learn from this plague, I believe. Chapter 12, verse number 12. Somebody read it for us.
"For I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both male and a man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt, and I will execute judgment. I am the Lord."
I'm going through Egypt, and everyone is going to feel the influence of that movement among them. Our God is inescapable. There is no escape from God. There is no person who can hide from His perceiving eye or the hand of His influence whenever He seeks to exert it. You can't escape God. We go from 4 plagues of inconvenience to 4 plagues of growing intensity to 1 plague of terror and a final plague of complete horror. So much so that the text says there was not a house in which there was not one dead. I want you to imagine in this community, in Lexington, Kentucky, ever how many households there are. All of the houses, all the apartments, every one of them. If, in an evening, in every one of those houses, at least one person died. I'll tell you what, how about 50% of them? How about 25% of them? How about 10% of them? Panic. Absolute panic. Every god that they had ever served, every sign that they had ever taken from the natural world to say the gods are on our side, they're taking care of us, they're causing us to be healthy and to grow. Gone. Now we got to dig deeper. Because these 2 chapters, chapter 11, chapter 12, are really, arguably, among the most significant in the entire record. They're significant. So let's talk about the plague of the firstborn and what we learn from it. Chapter 11, verse 4. Moses said, "Thus says the Lord, about midnight I will go out into the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn of the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the female servant who is behind the handmill, and all the firstborn of all the animals. And there shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as was not before, nor shall ever be like it again." By the way, that word cry is the same word used of Israel earlier on in this book, when they are being oppressed. The ones who made them cry in oppression are now going to cry in the greatest grief. The most precious thing. All right, because of my blunder, that is the first bell, right? Yeah. All right, thank you. The plague of the firstborn teaches us about the presence of the Lord. The Lord said to Moses, circle it, I. This is different than every plague before it. It is no longer hail. It is no longer a locust. It is no longer a gnat. It is no longer darkness. It is now I. Very personal. God says, I will bring one more plague on Pharaoh and on Egypt for two purposes. One is to punish them and to defeat them, which is the obvious one. The second one is to provide for Israel and to draw them to Him. There's a lengthy description here that says, when I complete this final plague, Pharaoh will drive you out altogether. So, now's the time. All of you go ask your neighbors for stuff. You remember, this is a prediction from earlier in the book. And they go out and they begin to get all kinds of articles of gold and of silver. Verse 3 says, the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, implying that they gave them abundantly so that they could be provided for in their wilderness journey. Moreover, it says, the man Moses became very great in the land of Egypt in the sight of Pharaoh's servants and in the sight of all the people. The presence of the Lord is for a purpose. That purpose, we might say, is His justice, verses 4 through 8. Thus says the Lord, about midnight, here it is again, I. About midnight, I will go out into the midst of Egypt. A phrase that is only used to describe judgment and justice. I am going out to exact justice. Two divisions. All the firstborn of the land of Egypt will die. But, verse 7, none of the children of Israel. Against them, not a single dog, which in this culture was the equivalent of our rat, by the way. Dogs were viewed in this time about like we view rats. There will not be a dog who will basically lick his tongue against an Israel man, woman, child, or beast. That you may know that the Lord makes a difference between the Egyptians and Israel. Moses says in verse 8, and all of these your servants, I believe these to be the same servants who were counseling Pharaoh earlier, let them go. These are his palace guards, his officials. They will bow down before me. They're going to come to me. The ones that usually bow down to you, Pharaoh, are now going to bow down to me and beg me to leave. Saying, get out. The end of verse 8 says, then he went out from Pharaoh in great anger. Now remember, he's already said, I'll never see you face to face. In all likelihood, Pharaoh wouldn't grant the meeting. So he's having a meeting with the servants, with the officials. He's having a face-to-face with somebody other than Pharaoh, it would appear, who are his proxy. He's communicating to Pharaoh just as though we would communicate to a representative of the president or the governor. But he leaves. And there's this great resistance, verse 9. The Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh will not heed you, so that my wonders may be multiplied in the land of Egypt. So Moses and Aaron did all the wonders before Pharaoh, and the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. He did not let the children of Israel go out of the land. Now you recognize, I hope, the introduction to what we're getting ready to read about in chapter 12, which becomes the most cherished part of of the Jewish economy. Everything in Old Testament theology revolves around what we read in chapter 12. And all of that from one plague. Thank you very much.